All right, good afternoon. This is the second of a pair of webinars so far on mastery-based learning in higher education in Washington. These webinars are in support of the work of the Mastery-Based Learning Work Group, which has been charged by the legislature to inform the governor, the legislature, and the public about barriers to mastery-based learning in Washington in K-12 education, and about opportunities to increase K-12 student access to mastery-based academic pathways aligned to their personal career goals and post-secondary education. So some of the best models for mastery-based learning are in higher education, and while there are major differences between K-12 and higher education systems, there may be much that could cross over and much that could be learned. That's why we're hearing from some of the experts in competency or mastery-based learning in higher education through these webinars, and we'll have time at our next meeting, our next in-person meeting, to discuss and debrief about these webinars. So I would encourage work group members to think about what might be applicable to K-12 as we listen to our speaker today, and we'll be able to discuss it at our next meeting. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ami Magisos, who is the Assistant Director of Policy and Planning at the Washington Student Achievement Council.
Hi, good afternoon. I am very happy to be able to share about academic credit for prior learning in Washington post-secondary education. And when I say post-secondary education, in terms of the Washington Student Achievement Council, I'm referring to 50 institutions of higher learning, so 34 community and technical colleges, 6 public baccalaureates, and 10 independent nonprofits. WASAC's role is within ACPL, Academic Credit for Prior Learning, is designated to convene a statewide work group with stakeholders in ACPL and prepare an annual progress report to the legislature on how the state is progressing on ACPL goals. At WASAC, we have 4 priority areas of work: affordability, enrollment, completion, and student supports. And ACPL aligns with at least 3 of those. In my role, I have a background in adult basic education from Arizona and also in student development advising, both at a community college, Peninsula College out in Port Angeles, and a baccalaureate college, the Evergreen State College. And I've been with WASAC a little over a year with a portfolio that includes the statewide adult re-engagement initiative, as well as developing that 4th priority area I mentioned, what we call non-academic student supports, especially food and housing security, childcare, and behavioral health. So our role with ACPL is in monitoring and encouraging statewide policies that are transparent and support students with academic credit for prior learning. I'm less familiar with the policies in individual colleges, so my focus today will be on what we know statewide. So as you have questions, there may be some that are outside of my scope, and I'd be happy to follow up after this webinar or try to connect you with others who can help. So today, I'd like to build the agenda based on some questions that Linda Drake suggested might be useful. We're going to talk about how in higher ed in Washington we define academic credit for prior learning and talk a little bit about its importance. We're going to talk about assessment. So how is credit awarded? How is it assessed? How common is academic credit for prior learning in our state in higher ed? And we're going to talk a little more specifically about prior experiential learning assessment that might be an interesting parallel to some of the work that you'll be doing. And if there's time at the end, we'll be able to have a bit of a discussion as you have questions. So first, I'd like to dive into some definitions. So in 2011, our state legislature defined prior learning and post-secondary education as the knowledge and skills gained through work and life experience, military training and experience, and also formal and informal education and training. So assessment of prior learning really allows people to earn credit and recognition for the skills and knowledge they have already acquired. So generally, an assessment of prior learning occurs after the student has enrolled in an institution. And if the student shows mastery of a subject by passing an assessment, then it's understood to be a result of prior learning. So I'm going to dive into the categories of assessment in just a little bit. A little bit of background about the legislation. In 2011, we had legislation that defines ACPL, mandated goals, and the work group, and it also required an annual progress report to the legislature on those goals. In 2014, we had another bit of legislation that was focused on military training policies within higher ed, and that's related. So the law requires colleges to maintain a list of courses that have been given credit in the past. And that's an important aspect because within the legislature, there's been a real focus on how veterans and active military students coming to higher ed or have their validation of their prior learning. Why is this important, especially for adult learners? So in 2010, there was a study by the National Council on Adult and Experiential Learning, and it was looking at prior learning assessment outcomes in 48 institutions. And it found that students who received prior learning credit had a higher degree earning rate over 7 years than students who hadn't received PLA students. So 56% degree earning rate compared to 21%. And that was regardless of the institution size or level, regardless of students' academic level, financial age, financial status, or students' demographic status. It also found that students were more persistent with higher levels of credit accumulation than non-PLA students, and had a shorter time to degree, so an average of 2.5 and 10 months of time saved compared to non-PLA graduates. So really, I think the nation with this report began to recognize how important it is to respect and acknowledge the skills and knowledge students bring with them. And it really helped build that understanding nationally about how we can inspire students' confidence in new learning when we acknowledge their prior learning. It also reduces the prerequisites and general education credits that help launch students more quickly into their chosen career pathway. So there's kind of an affordability angle to it as well, that students can move faster through their degree. With this research base showing the connection between academic credit for prior learning and retention and completion, we see ACPL as a part of meeting Washington State's long-term educational attainment goals. And we remember, of course, that the state has this 100% high school diploma or equivalent and 70% post-secondary credential for all Washington adults aged 25 to 44. That is something that we have, that we're all working toward. Currently, we are on the post-secondary end just at 57%. So we've got a lift, and ACPL is seen as one of the strategies that can help move us forward. So within higher education, in Washington, I want to be really clear that there is no statewide or cross-sector policy on ACPL. Thus, the policies in our state are very individualized by the institutions. We are a very decentralized higher education system in Washington. So prior learning outcomes are assessed in our state and found to be equivalent to specific college course outcomes. And the awarding of credit has to be consistent with the policy of the institution. So there isn't a way that I can say, oh, here's our statewide policy. Really, our statewide policy is that each institution should have a policy. So Linda had asked, how is college credit defined for the purposes of ACPL? It is defined by the college faculty in their courses. So prior learning is assessed to evaluate whether the prior learning outcomes are equivalent to the outcomes the college has already determined as creditworthy in their courses. Within our higher education system, we have the challenges and limitations, shall we say, about accreditation around prior experiential learning, which specifically refers to the portfolio mode of assessment. There used to be some limitations that came from our accrediting body, and now there are some limitations through our Joint Transfer Council around the DTA degree. In the community and technical colleges, let me go back one. In the community and technical colleges, there is transferability between community colleges, but with the baccalaureate institutions, from community college to baccalaureate institutions, it is not something that's uniform. It is, dependent on each institution arranging that transferability and articulation between the CTCs and the four-year baccalaureate institution. So Linda had asked, how is ACPL awarded for work experience? And I want to be really clear that specifically credit is awarded for prior learning. So experience doesn't necessarily equal learning. And so in our assessments, you'll note that largely it's about how do we get to the learning that came from a particular experience. So there are a variety of categories of assessment, and the Northwest Commission on Colleges and Universities, which is our accrediting body, correlates these categories to accreditation standards in these kind of 4 buckets. So there's credits by testing, which include standardized exams. So CLEP, or College Level Examination Program. DSST is the Dante's Standardized Subject Test that you see in military environments. Next is extra institutional learning. So that includes military or industrial training or certifications. And we have a body called American Council on Education that provides recommendations for military training and education and how they correlate to particular courses. That really bridges the gap between the learning outcomes that we see in military terms and learning outcomes described in terms associated with higher education. So it's helpful to have that bridge. Crosswalks are another way that we can get at that extra institutional learning. They're developed by the institutions, the higher ed institutions. They describe how training programs such as apprenticeships or other kinds of standardized training or industry certificates compare to a college's current course offerings. So faculty evaluate the curriculum and learning outcomes of the prior training program to determine how well it matches the learning outcomes in their courses. And that creates a kind of articulated connection between the 2 sets of learning outcomes that, once it's created, can be used to grant student credits for their experience without doing it every time. It can be a common prior learning program. In the case of course challenges, those are generally developed by faculty. An example might be a demonstration of a welding skill. In the case of a written or oral, it might be a comprehensive final exam for a course or a foreign language demonstration. One of the challenges we see with this particular type of assessment is the cost for faculty compensation as they're developing those exams. The last category is the one that everyone kind of associates with academic credit for prior learning, and that's experiential learning. So prior experiential learning is where a student creates a portfolio where they capture evidence that identifies the learning outcomes correlated to a specific class that they mastered through a variety of experiences. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about that in a bit. So Linda asked that I share how widely ACPL is used in Washington. And that's part of what we track in our annual legislative report. So from our 2019 report of the 50 institutions and their credits, you'll see that there's increases in the number of credits over the years in 2 of our 3 sectors. So we have community and technical colleges. They've had a slight enrollment decrease in recent years, but they've had a kind of steady increase in academic credit for prior learning credits. Private baccalaureates also this year have increased in their number of academic credit for prior learning actual credits, and with the public baccalaureates we see a slight decrease. So when we look at the categories of academic credit for prior learning, we can understand the trends a little bit better. So bear with me on a complex table here from our report with just a few highlights that we learned from it. So first of all, last year, the number of students receiving academic credit for prior learning increased overall by 36.4% statewide. So you see that right here. Academic credit for prior learning in most categories of prior learning assessment have increased since the previous year, 2017-18, including CLEP, portfolio review, occupational crosswalks, individual industry certifications, and credit by exam. So we see that increase happening here in most categories. The 2 areas where we don't see an increase is the Dantes, and the percentage is a little bit, you know, we don't want to read too much into that because the actual number of credits is not a big number. And we also see a decrease in enrollments in the ACEs, the ACE program here, and that's kind of the larger decrease that we see. We know that there has been a decrease in vets and active military and CTC, so that might be correlated. Overall, the assessment types that had the highest number of students and the highest number of credits, so what's the most popular among all these kinds of ACPL, we see ACE, individual industry certifications, and occupational crosswalks as being the most commonly given credit. So Linda had also asked if I had a sense of policies that tend to work well in terms of students being awarded academic credit for demonstrable skills and learning that allows them to successfully transition into the next level of college courses. So in your case, since you're looking at that, I would say in the cases of work, internships, volunteer experiences of high school students, as we think about higher ed and how that might be useful, it seems like the assessment modes that most closely relate might be credit by exam. So if students have learned a specific skill that can be tested, portfolio, which is that creation of evidence and narrative that describes how they've met outcomes, or possibly a crosswalk if their learning experiences were standardized in some way. So first I'll talk a little bit about crosswalks. So they, in the higher ed world, compare college course outcomes with industry training outcomes. So I have an example here of Highland College's administration of justice in criminal law, their CJ 110 course, and the outcomes are compared to the outcomes of the Washington State Basic Law Enforcement Academy. So you can kind of see how that outcomes list is compared. We also have another example of the Washington State Department of Health that provides different types of crosswalks which describe the similarities and differences between military and civilian roles in health occupations. So I can provide a link to that if that's at all helpful. Let's talk about prior experiential learning assessment or portfolio. So many of our institutions have portfolio as an assessment option within their policies. So 18 of our 34 CTCs reported portfolio credits awarded last year, and about half of the public four-year institutions reported having portfolio credits. Schools can assess a variety of learning experiences with this portfolio review process. So the student creates a portfolio of prior experiences, and they have the job of articulating how the prior learning led the student to mastery of a specific course learning outcome. And again, it's not just, oh, I have experience in this, but how does it match directly to course learning outcomes for existing courses? So this portfolio is a kind of compilation of evidence. The evidence can be in the form of certificates, pictures of projects, maybe it's an affidavit from an employer, and the writing that the student does that proves understanding and application. Maybe it's video, maybe it's some other way that they are documenting it. One of the things that we find is that students often need help translating those life experiences into the learning objectives and identifying evidence to demonstrate their mastery of the objectives. So a lot of times colleges will offer a portfolio class as an option to guide students through that development process of their portfolio. And this is a way also to facilitate students' reflection on their learning and their preferences and challenges. The portfolio class, if that's offered, can also teach skills that are useful to students, like articulating how their prior learning meets the outcomes in that specific college course. So it's kind of learning a writing, expository writing approach. Sometimes colleges will offer a technical writing credit for that portfolio development course, and students then would get that credit as well as whatever additional credit they might get from their portfolio. The method of portfolio involves more time, obviously, on both the part of the student and the part of the faculty, more than many other modes of assessment. So there are a few considerations to keep in mind when thinking about portfolios. So faculty are the ones that would be leading it. Students with considerable work and other experience may be able to provide initial evidence through a resume or a list of previous training showing that course objectives have been met. That Council on Adult and Experiential Education, Experiential Learning, CAEL, they also have an online course that they provide. So that's another route to go, and they have a kind of survey to find out, is portfolio an appropriate fit for a particular student. If that portfolio development curriculum isn't already there at an institution, then an institution might have to do that, or tap into other online resources like CAEL's online course. So an example that you might want to consider that's close to us, those of us who live in Olympia, is the Evergreen State College. I'm including a link here. They have a broad range of academic credit for prior learning opportunities across these types of assessment, but they have a Writing from Life course that's that portfolio development course that students can do for credit. And that is a great option for adults, especially who are returning. So that might be something to look at. I've also included here a link to the Learning Counts research that's provided on portfolio in particular at the Council on Adult and Experiential Learning. So I'd like to close with just a little bit about where we're headed for ACPL work group in case that's useful to you in your planning, and leave you with some resources. One is that, data collection and the development of annual report is kind of standardized at this point for the 50 institutions of higher ed. But this year, the work group is also looking at what we can learn by disaggregating our student data to understand who is receiving ACPL in our institutions by gender, race and ethnicity, age, military status, and there are 3 institutions that are kind of pioneering that work with us on disaggregated data to better understand who is currently receiving ACPL. Their hope is that they can develop this and that we could have a disaggregated student data picture statewide if we can expand the survey. So that's an exciting point that will really allow us to understand with an equity lens who is receiving ACPL and what could we adjust in both policies and processes to make sure that it's equitably taken advantage of by students. We're also very interested in diving into more research on how ACPL in Washington is affecting retention and completion. We have an ACPL handbook that has been prepared years ago, and we'll be updating that again soon. A lot of the things I've referenced are kind of available there for you. And it includes sample policies, examples of assessments. I've included a couple of those here. And the work group is also providing annual workshops. So in April 15th, we'll have one that's focusing on ACPL equity, transparency of policies, and transfer between CTCs and baccalaureate institutions. And the last thing I would say is that we are connecting the Academic Credit for Prior Learning work group and efforts together with Washington's Adult Reengagement Initiative, which is trying to increase adult learners' awareness of higher education and especially for those with some credit, no degree, to return and to take advantage of ACPL to go further faster. I've included some resources here. The Washington Student Achievement Council policy page on ACPL is your go-to source for reports, handbook, the legislation information, and past work groups. The handbook is there. And as far as a policy resource for you, you might consider looking specifically at the State Board for Community and Technical Colleges guidelines around prior learning assessment. So I've included that link here. So lots of information, and if we have time left and you'd like to ask any questions now, that'd be great, or I can follow up with any questions you might have over the next week or two.
Does anyone have any questions? Okay, well, we are going to put a recording of this online on our website, on our Mastery-based website. So the members that weren't able to be with us today can also view it and listen to it. And if there are any further questions that folks want to email to me, I can pass them on to Amy. And thank you very much, Amy. I think that was really, really informative. I appreciate it very much.
You're welcome. I'm happy to answer any questions in an ongoing way. So good luck with your work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.